This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Book 1. Introduction. Chapter 1. The General Theory. I have called this book The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, placing the emphasis on the prefix general. The object of such a title is to contrast the character of my arguments and conclusions with those of the classical theory of the subject, upon which I was brought up, and which dominates the economic thought, both practical and theoretical, of the governing and academic classes of this generation, as it has for 100 years past. Footnote. The classical economists was a name invented by Marx to cover Ricardo and James Mill and their predecessors, that is to say, for the founders of the theory which culminated in the Ricardian economics. I have become accustomed, perhaps perpetrating a solecism, to include in the classical school the followers of Ricardo, those, that is to say, who adopted and perfected the theory of the Ricardian economics, including, for example, J.S. Mill, Marshall, Edgeworth, and Professor Pigou. End of footnote. I shall argue that the postulates of the classical theory are applicable to a special case only, and not to the general case, the situation which it assumes being a limiting point of the possible positions of equilibrium. Moreover, the characteristics of the special case assumed by the classical theory happen not to be those of the economic society in which we actually live, with the result that its teaching is misleading and disastrous if we attempt to apply it to the facts of experience. Chapter 2. The Postulates of the Classical Economics. Most treatises on the theory of value and production are primarily concerned with the distribution of a given volume of employed resources between different uses, and with the conditions which, assuming the employment of this quantity of resources, determine their relative rewards and the relative values of their products. Footnote. This is in the Ricardian tradition, for Ricardo expressly repudiated any interest in the amount of the national dividend as distinct from its distribution. In this, he was assessing correctly the character of his own theory. But his successors, less clear-sighted, have used the classical theory in discussions concerning the causes of wealth. Vide Ricardo's letter to Malthus of October 9, 1820. Political economy, you think, is an inquiry into the nature and causes of wealth. I think it should be called an inquiry into the laws which determine the division of the produce of industry amongst the classes who concur in its formation. No law can be laid down respecting quantity, but a tolerably correct one can be laid down respecting proportions. Every day I am more satisfied that the former enquiry is vain and delusive, and the latter only the true objects of the science. End of footnote. The question also of the volume of the available resources, in the sense of the size of the employable population, the extent of natural wealth, and the accumulated capital equipment, has often been treated descriptively. But the pure theory of what determines the actual employment of the available resources has seldom been examined in great detail. To say that it has not been examined at all would of course be absurd, for every discussion concerning fluctuations of employment, of which there have been many, has been concerned with it. I mean, not that the topic has been overlooked, but that the fundamental theory underlying it has been deemed so simple and obvious that it has received at the most a bare mention. Footnote. For example, Professor Pigou, in the Economics of Welfare, writes, quote, "Throughout this discussion, except when the contrary is expressly stated, the fact that some resources are generally unemployed against the will of the owners is ignored. This does not affect the substance of the argument, while it simplifies its exposition." Unquote. Thus, whilst Ricardo expressly disclaimed any attempt to deal with the amount of the national dividend as a whole, Professor Pigou in a book which is specifically directed to the problem of the national dividend, maintains that the same theory holds when there is some involuntary unemployment, as in the case of full employment. End of footnote. The classical theory of employment, supposedly simple and obvious, has been based, I think, on two fundamental postulates, though practically without discussion, namely, 1. The wage is equal to the marginal product of labour. That is to say, the wage of an employed person is equal to the value which would be lost if employment were to be reduced by 1 unit, after deducting any other costs which this reduction of output would avoid. Subject, however, to the qualification that the equality may be disturbed in accordance with certain principles if competition and markets are imperfect. 2. The utility of the wage, when a given volume of labour is employed, is equal to the marginal disutility of that amount of employment. That is to say, the real wage of an employed person is that which is just sufficient, in the estimation of the employed persons themselves, to induce the volume of labour actually employed to be forthcoming.